activate because there are multiple screens.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect. I can try to get a clicker.
No, I think it should work. I will simply move a bit, but that's healthy anyhow. Okay, so before I start with the findings, let me just give you a couple of keywords on the basics of our conceptual framework in EnTrust. And to tell you that when we drafted the proposal, we were thinking that we were quite innovative and saying that we don't only have to address trust, but also address explicitly distrust. Now, 3 years later, everybody agrees that distrust is basically something important. Everybody is distrusting now everybody. The war in Ukraine, we're distrusting Russians, we're distrusting governments, we're distrusting populist parties. So basically, distrust is not only a given, but even a virtue, has become a virtue of political activity. So I don't want to be preaching something that is evident. However, I think this makes clear why we are so interested in the two aspects, because we argue that distrust and trust are not only endpoints of a continuum, but that trust and distrust are simply two different things that can coexist at the same time. So I can be trustful of governments and distrustful on the same time. And this means that I have to look what makes politicians, for instance, trustful and distrustful at the same time. And our expectations is that these are different things that can't coexist. So it makes the topic a little bit more complicated, but that's the nice thing, more interesting. And you see that certainly we're also interested in different levels of aggregation, but here I think this is quite evident. The second element of our conceptual framework is reciprocity. That we argue that you can't understand relations of or aspects of trust and distrust if you don't put it into reciprocal relations. And as you already see, basically the focus of EnTrust is the relation between citizens and political institutions. And I think this is a bit different than TiGRE. So we are mainly interested in citizen institutional relations, and here we argue reciprocity. So citizens might distrust politicians because they feel distrusted by politicians. Citizens might trust local authorities because they feel trusted. So there is a kind of a interrelation and reciprocity, and we want to understand the dynamics of trust building and distrust building, basically. In different arenas and in different countries, because we argue that if you look at the reciprocity, you come up with cultures of distrust or cultures of trust. And they might diverge between policy domains, between institutions, but also between countries. Now, this is the reason, just a very brief overview of our aims, very general ones. That's why we are interested in arenas, because we argue that if you want to analyze reciprocal relations of distrust and trust, you have to look at arenas where trust and distrust are formed, contended, reflected upon. And as you see, we have different levels. So we move from the local level, the street level, because there we argue this is real interactions between real citizens and real representatives of public authorities. We move then to the field of political contentions, basically organized protest movements, challenging with institutions over specific issues. There we also argue that we can look how trust or distrust is formed or eroded, and we look at the public sphere. On the one hand, by simple instruments of population surveys, but also analysis of media content, because here we're interested in how is trust and distrust also verbalized and contended in the public sphere, not only by journalists, but also by citizens who comment on a news article. So we are looking also at not only at media products, but also at Facebook commenting functions. So just so that you get a sense that we want to put hands on this reciprocal element. Now this leads us then to the street level, which we think is particularly important. So what I'm going to tell you in the following half an hour, 40 minutes, is the focus on institutional trust, but here not the institutions that normally are in the focus of analysis, so basically policy decision-making institutions, but here it's rather those who deliver policies, so implementation, and particularly those public authorities at the local level. So we are really interested at the street level, because this is basically where we can observe, or at least we can ask people about real experiences. Now we think that this is relevant as a focus of analysis, because for many citizens, public authorities are important in everyday life matters. So some citizens can even evade a regular meeting with a street level bureaucrat, so there is something to be said about. We assume that the street level also implies encounters, so real face-to-face encounters or digital in times of COVID. So we can expect that there is not only a meeting of citizens with institutions as an organization, as a building, but also physical or real interactions with people, and that they thus are responsible for experiences that people make, and that might be responsible for the way how they form attitudes and they adapt their behavior. So this is basically the rationale behind it, and here the empirical analysis we did. Also during COVID, it was quite demanding. We decided to look at a specific case, namely social welfare provision, so social assistance for vulnerable families. So this means specific authorities. This might be job placement entities, family counseling. This might be medical services. So all services provided to vulnerable families. I'm going to tell you why we selected this. We did it in all 7 countries of the consortium, and the choice of the countries is certainly also in TiGRE tried to map diversity. So we have different socioeconomic context, but we also have different welfare regimes. So we try to control, if you like, for the diversity of political and socioeconomic contexts. And then we did qualitative interviewing, most of them online, some of them face-to-face. And it took us almost a year to finalize the field work. Well, you can imagine why. We are struggling with similar problems that we did. Now, the interesting thing is this case might seem odd, but we conceive this to be a critical or extreme case. And why? Well, because we had basically theoretical assumptions. It is a critical case because the relation between vulnerable citizens or families and institutions is a hard one. It is an extreme one because we might assume that there is little trust. At least this is what we expect from research, and hence we are interested in seeing is there any trust, and if yes, when and how. So it's critical. So if in this case there is trust, then we can maybe generalize the mechanisms of trust building for everybody else. So that's basically the reasoning behind the critical case analysis. But it turned out that this is an extreme case, because indeed we find a lot of distrust, mutual distrust, and that's why basically this is something interesting to find. Now, this is a problem. Can we generalize? Because as a critical case, we could opt for generalization. With an extreme case, we don't know whether we can generalize, but here I'm happy to hear your feedback. Now, what research so far has told is distrust. Vulnerable people don't trust institutions. I'm simplistic now, but let's put it very very bluntly, just to get the expectations we had. And we also know from frontline workers, so street-level workers, they are also very distrustful. Well, professionally, if they are social workers, they have learned to be trustful of people, and they say that. However, in regard to institutions, they themselves are highly distrustful. They feel betrayed by politicians because they have to do the dirty job of politicians. They are distrustful of the superiors because they always feel controlled and checked with incredible workload of work and pressure of doing it quickly and efficiently. They also feel betrayed by some clients, not all, but this makes something with them. So you see, there is little room to expect trust. However, initially we thought, well, we should at least find some trust in some countries. Denmark, now you can remember Scandinavian countries. From research, we know these are wealthy countries, let's put it this way, with a high investment in social welfare, with universalist orientation, very personalized services. So here we would say trust. While Greece and Italy, we know levels of trust are low anyhow, with the problems they have, welfare regime, little trust. So this was our expectation. Now, let's go to the findings. I don't know if you can read, I included some quotes because this is basically qualitative analysis. We are extracting findings from the quotes. What we found out is distrust in institutions, everywhere. Also in Denmark. We found almost no citizen that we interviewed that trusted the institutions. And this is true for Germany and Denmark itself. And it was even the case that also in the Danish institutions, there were people distrusting the system. As you see in one of the red colored feedbacks. And the people gave a lot of reasoning. So first, what I call the opacity of the system. So people complain that the system is fragmented, that they don't know who is responsible, that they are chased from one office to the next. So there is an organized irresponsibility. At the end of the day, you don't get what you are entitled to because there is a chaos of accountability and responsibility issues. There is power felt by people. I'm in need, I'm desperate in need, and people are humiliating me, are treating me badly with disrespect. So here we encounter the experience of hierarchy as something negative. And please remember, these are people who are really vulnerable, either coming out of jail or with drug problems or violence in the family, also fearing to lose their children if the authority finds out that they are beating children or that there are problems with schooling. So these are real severe problems that are difficult for trust building. The carelessness, now they feel as a number. 5 minutes they get, no more. People are replaced, caseworkers are replaced. So that's something on both sides people are concerned about, and certainly also welfare chauvinism. We find particularly very strong in Greece and Italy complaints that the wrong people are getting help, and that me, as a Greek, I'm not getting help. So here also another criticism of the wrong allocation of services is a reason for distrusting the system. Interesting enough is there is more difference within countries than between countries. And one of the core differences is those units in the social systems system that are responsible for cash. They are the least trusted because here there are sanctions. You get the money, you don't get the money. While the counseling departments, there you find a lot of trust because there also people have a longer history of counseling. There people are not deciding about money. They are rather deciding about action plans, about basically help. So you see, it is interesting. The more power and hierarchy becomes prominent within this institutional system, the more trust is killed. So that's the interesting thing. Variance within countries is bigger than between countries. Now, is there at all any kind of trust? And there what we found out, yes, there is trust, but only personal trust. So, and here what I try to elicit here is that basically, here we are with Weber, bureaucracies don't require trust. And they try to free themselves from trust when they organize the formal procedures. So you have to submit an application and you have to present documents, official documents that prove that you are eligible and that you are in need. And you have to come to interviews where you have to validate your claims. There are means testing procedures, eligibility checks, and you have at the end of the day to sign an action plan, and then you are committed to follow through. And if you don't, you get sanctions. No trust at all. However, what we found out is that interviews are the most important element of this procedure, also for the caseworkers, because basically they say on the basis of the paper I cannot decide, and I cannot also decide about which benefits and which systems, and for this I have to meet the vulnerable families and discuss with them. And that's why these interviews are quite important. And these encounters are the place where, indeed, trust is at stake. And here we have basically two elements which we found out. There is a strategic element. There is an instrumental element. So basically, trust makes things easier. And that's why both sides invest in trust building, because it makes things easier. However, what we also find out is that the more time people need, the more they can't evade to develop either distrust or trust. Basically, more trust than distrust. So there is a logic, dynamics of trust building simply by the factor time. And this is basically the two core problems. Now, to sensitize you for the dynamic of this bargaining element, now I'm looking only at encounters, is basically the shadow of hierarchies. So these encounters are always happening within a highly hierarchical setting. Everybody knows that. The two sides are very diplomatic and very nice, and they have learned how to be very nice, but at the end of the day, they know formal procedures. And both sides know that at the end of the day, it's the public authority deciding if the family gets the help or not. But also the caseworker knows that at the end of the day, the citizen could go to court and put his case to court. So there is always the option of power in behind. And this is relevant to understand the dynamic of power. However, people know that this is dysfunctional because you can't go all the time to court. And you want to get quick assistance. You are in need, desperate need. So here the question is how to bridge vulnerabilities and social assistance. And this is done by bargaining. The encounter element. And here basically trust becomes core. Now let's look quickly at the strategies of frontline workers and then of citizens, so that you get a sense of how basically trust is built under adverse circumstances. But I need to indicate that we are speaking here of implicit strategies, because sometimes people directly tell them that this is a strategy, an instrumental strategy. But very often it is rather deduced by us when looking at the interviews and the data, that we assume that there is kind of a rule behind it. And a rule that basically has an aim. So have a soft definition of strategies. Now, first of all, frontline workers know that they have to step out of the shadow of power. And they have to step out of the idiosyncrasies of bureaucratic organizations if they want to reach out to citizens. They can use sanctions, they try to avoid. Why? Well, because as soon as they take out the big stick, dead, no trust anymore. So that's why very often to us in the interviews they said, if I can avoid it, I don't use sanctions. And they even tell the clients that they abstain from using power, kind of as a peace diplomacy, if you like. Second element, and this is a strong one, is they try to devote as much time as possible to clients. Well, this is not the case for all caseworkers, but we found out that many of them, particularly those who are trained in social work, they at least have the ambition of giving people more time. They try to free themselves as much as they can to help citizens, but the constraints are very strong because they don't have time. Now, there are very specific strategies of how they do that. They don't devote to all their cases at the same time, but maybe to those which they think are most pressing or where they get along the best, which means that this is a very selective strategy. And that's also how the citizens experience it. They also say, it's not the rule that I have a good caseworker whom I can trust. There is always one, if they are lucky. So you see, it's a very selective strategy of opting out of the high workload. So here we basically have the problem of institutional settings that, in a way, narrow down the amount of trust building caseworkers can do. Then certainly guarantee closeness in privacy. So it means going out of the building of the public authority, visiting people at home, although this is tricky because they feel sometimes threatened by visits at home, because this could be perceived as checking whether children should be taken out of the family. So this is a diplomatic high exercise, but there are intermediate strategies of closeness. In Denmark, for instance, they have counseling hours in schools, at the schools where the families are located. So it's neutral, if you like, neutral territory, but it signals that caseworkers really want to be close to them. So you see there is a spatial dimension, but there is also a symbolic dimension of closeness. The argument of safe spaces. So what you tell me here remains here. And this is something that is, I think, highly important for vulnerable families, because they always fear that if they are sincere, and if they tell them their problems, that this might be used against them. And it is used against them. So if you have a mother who says, sometimes I don't take care of my child because I'm in drugs, or I have a problem with my husband, or I have to look for my job, whatever. You can imagine what this makes with family counselors. So you see here you have this element of safe space that seems to be essential to this element of bonding, if you want to put it this way. And certainly also impression management, something that in sociology we know. So the problem is if you have a young caseworker, clients will say, what do you know about life? What do you know about having families and children? So this is a problem that caseworkers have to do, and that's why basically they try to use strategically, if they are mothers or fathers, and they tell, I know how it is to have a child, and the child don't behave as I want. So this are basically the argument they use to build basically commonalities, to build closeness. So overall, we can see that basically caseworkers are happy to do the first step and to give a credit of trust. So, and this is something we know from micro sociology of trust building. This is an investment. Somebody has to start with a trust building, and here basically the one who is in their superior situation has more power, is easier for him or her to do the first step. So I think that makes sense, but it is indeed also perceived as something important in the process of bargaining. However, we should not forget that this is not a benevolent aspect. But if caseworkers say that they give a credit of trust, they expect returns. So I'm trusting you. I'm not using sanctions. I expect that you tell me the truth. So there is a bargaining element in it, and citizens know that. They tell us also. Some of them told us that they in some way also feel under pressure by nice caseworkers to cooperate. This, I think, is quite logical if we follow the idea of bargaining. Now, let's look at the strategies of citizens, and I would say they are complementary. Most of the feedback basically tells that they wait for the first positive sign of trust, and this, I think, makes sense because they report to have seen so many faces that they go into encounters with no expectations, or with the worst expectations. Let's put it this way. So mistrust at the beginning is the default, and then they see what they get, how the other side responds, and then basically they start collaborating, giving confidential information. And then basically from there on is indeed a bargain where it is a give and take. Right? And they themselves say that it is a pragmatic approach where basically they always react, but this indeed is a reactive sentence to what the caseworker does. So if the encounter develops well in their own perception, they invest more. If they have the impression that the caseworker can't be trusted because the stick is still in his pocket, then you can imagine that the citizens report of not really cooperating. So here we have really a very strong bargaining element. However, as I said, the other element is the more also citizens get to know caseworkers, and the longer the caseworkers also stay in contact with them, the more there is, I would say, a natural development of closer relationships, particularly if they get along well. And we have in our data set also citizens who say that there are private feelings behind this encounter. So seeing the caseworker as a mother or as a friend, or in some cases even as a lover. So you see that there are even intimate relations between caseworkers and their clients, although this is illegal, basically. But that's what clients told us. Okay, so I'm moving to the end of my presentation, trying to summarize and then discussing with you the extent to which we can generalize. So here I mark the similarities. This has to do with the method, because qualitative methods are quite bad in highlighting differences and then basically proving that the differences are due to specific factors. So what qualitative research is very good is to work out commonalities, and we found out a lot of commonalities. So I'm summarizing basically what I said. We have a case where institutional distrust is the rule. Well, not for all caseworkers, because some still believe in the system, otherwise they would be frustrated. There is criticism, but particularly on the level of citizens, we have incredibly strong institutional distrust, which means that if there is any trust, it's not an institutionally organized relation of trust, trusting procedures, trusting rules, trusting law. It is trusting people. That's basically it. So we move from institutional to personal trust. That's the interesting finding according to me. And this means that trust then is basically a thing emerging from interactions, negotiated. There is an instrumental element, but I would say that there is more than an instrumental element. And finally, what we certainly can say everywhere is that the room for bargaining personal trust is certainly predefined by the institutional setting. So depending on how you organize public authorities, how you organize procedures, you can either kill completely any kind of personal trust, or you can provide rooms for personal trust. And they are welfare regimes who try to expand the scope of personal trust development. This is true for Denmark, but we also had a discussion with one of the leading bosses of the Polish family allowances departments, and he was saying that he is trying to fight for separating more clearly between counseling and cash benefits, because he said it is essential to provide safe places and to provide basically rooms for personal trust building, because this would then also ease cash benefit payment. And so you see there is also a policy debate about improving the institutional settings. But this is not unproblematic, because bureaucracies are also suspicious about too much personal trust development. And this is something that we also need to take into consideration. Second set of conclusions, and this is more as points of contention for the discussion. So for what we see is that basically personal trust has a functional role to play, and basically for the clients as well as for the employees, it needs to repair the deficiencies of the system. Employees have a lot to do. They want to evade going to court, so they want to have life as simple as possible. So as you see there, the element of repairing the problem of their work. This is, I think, quite clear. However, it is important to understand that both sides might know that there is an instrumental strategic element behind it. But if personal trust is to be developed, both sides should not remain with a purely instrumental orientation, because if both sides know that the other side is just cooperating for pure instrumental reasons, there will be no trust building. That's the paradox. If you want to develop trust, you have to overcome the impression that there is just strategic instrumental aims behind it. It has to become personal. And that's also the way how people describe trustful caseworkers. They don't only say they are open and reliable. Well, this could be said for a good public servant. Public servants should be open and reliable. That's their job. They have to be accountable. However, very often both sides say that for trust it's important to be close, to be warm, to be caring. Sometimes even said as a mother, as a father. So you see there is explicit reference to private notions of trust. And this then is an interesting aspect we know from sociology of bureaucracy and street-level bureaucracy, that there is this element of formal and informal. So in informal, a lot of everyday life rules and norms applies in organizing work. And this seems to be a case also in regards to trust building, but it has consequences for institutional trust. Because what we always were concerned when we did the field work is there any chance that the interactions lead to more institutional trust? And the answer is no. The more experiences vulnerable people have with institutions, there is the more trust, or the more selective or random or whatever. No, there is no trust in spite of, and this basically is a reason. Trust remains on the level of pure personal encounters. And that's why both sides do not learn that you could trust the institution. You learn you have to distrust the institution. You could trust the person. And that's why it is so hard for a spillover effect of trust building. And that's why we assume that, that maybe encounters can be repaired, but that institutional trust cannot be repaired on the level of individual bargaining. And this basically is a more pessimistic outlook, that basically we need completely different instruments to repair institutional distrust, particularly on the side of the citizens who are most dependent on public authorities. So I'm coming to an end here, and I'm very happy to hear your comments and insights. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christian, for this very rich talk. I think it gives a lot of food for thought to us. I found it truly fascinating, very lively, very differentiated. Even though in the end it is a bit pessimistic, and well, seen from the angle of political science, it is not that surprising that given this kind of situations, where these situations have, I would say, an explosive potential, and we can maybe perhaps better understand also the lack of identification of people with the political system, the rise of populist movements. You refer to welfare chauvinism. I think these things are related. Well, we do have a few minutes for the discussion. So,
Guys.
Yes, go ahead.
So maybe you I don't want to.
Rael, Matt, Stefan.
So, okay. Thank you so much. Two questions, and the one is related to the time frame of the relationship. As far as I understood, this would mean, and people should get out of the social welfare system as soon as possible. So that is what I understand. So we never know if it's just kind of very short-term relation, you're just having kind of handing in forms once, and then you are going to the first labor market again, or so what role does time play? Because too much trust could lead people staying in the system, maybe, or that is one question. The second one, thinking about, let's say, police, the other kind of street-level bureaucracy, where we have the carrot and the stick in the same hands always, because it's a policeman that poses a sanction, but yet at the same time can help me out. So what would be the implications for all cases where we cannot just separate these two roles? Because I find that striking, very interesting finding, also I think with implications for us, but what if we can separate these two roles?
Yep. Well, the first question, that's a very good comment I take with me, because I think we would need to check whether this makes a difference. And I think you suggest that it should make a difference. And I think that's a very good point. We did not check for that so far, because we are still in the midst of analyzing. But indeed, it is the case that some families are just transitorily asking for help. They are in a precarious situation of partnership broke up, unemployed, whatever, transition from study to work. They will be out somewhere. And this is indeed an interesting question. Are they different? But we have also a big proportion of families who stay there. As long as they have children, as long as they are families, they are basically constant contact. The hard cases, if you like. And here, so basically we maybe have different degrees of vulnerability, terrible word. And this might have an impact. So we have to check. We didn't check for police, that's true. This would be an interesting aspect. We didn't. So that's why now we cannot look at this. But we spoke with institutions who are close to sanctions, so the cash benefits, and there it is, the logic is quite destructive. There is very, very little room for help. Although I think your idea is very suggestive that police might also help people, women, when they are beaten. But this is a question, has this any long-term effects on their attitudes and behaviors? Because this is a one-time intervention, and this is very difficult to assess. So I'm sorry, I'm unable to answer these two important questions, but I will take a look.
Thank you. Matt was on my list.
Thanks so much for your talk. It was really fascinating, rich data. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how institutionalized or non-institutionalized are the relationships between the street level bureaucrats and the citizens. So often, particularly at the local, the hyper local level, the state is kind of like it's not really that present in some countries. So in the UK, where I'm from, often these, particularly like social work, for example, is contracted out multiple times, often to local charities or organisations that would barely be called organisations. They're like 5 people that are not trying to see as many people as possible. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about how those relationships look in the country.
Yeah, that's true. In Italy, the system is also similar because some services are outsourced. There's more cooperation with NGOs, also with medical institutions. So there is differences between countries. But the interesting thing is, at the end of the day, the findings were very similar. Yeah. So the institutional organization of the whole delivery system of assistance does not affect very clearly. Now, in detail, I would need to check with colleagues who are doing the analysis. I will take the question to them. But generally speaking, I would say that also the case, the frontline workers also in all countries were complaining about the bureaucratic overload, documentation. They are always paperwork all the time. And that's what they say. They find little time to speak, to deal with people, because they have so much paperwork. So there is this very strong criticism, and this means that indeed the room for direct encounters is very, very limited. And this was even the case during COVID, because the encounters were digital, so there were no face-to-face encounters between families and services. But this, according to them, did not change the logic of encounters. So indeed, we have to understand encounters are really a very specific moment in the very long, fully bureaucratized process. And the bureaucratized process is basically classical Weber, written documents. And that's essential. And however, encounters are described by everybody as the decisive moment in the development of a case. So even if the encounters are maybe from the time very short, they are incredibly decisive. That's what everybody says. And this is even for those who are working as public servants in the state authority. So basically, at the end of the day, the differences between the outsourced services and the in-sourced are not that big. But I would need to check. That's a good question.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yes, also thanks. I'm really fascinated. Just a lot of things that I think are very recognizable. Also, I think in the Netherlands. So, and also like 200 interviews or something. Also very hard to reach group. So really fantastic. And one question about I think it's the last point about the spillover from personal to institutional trust. That does not really happen. I thought it might also have to be have to do with the way so that the institution is designed, because it's designed for distrust. Both, I mean, if you look at for instance, the Dutch situation, we had this big scandal with the tax agency, which was sort of the institution was built to distrust people in a way, to control them and to punish them. So instead of sort of saying, well, we should focus on this micro level and help people to build this personal relationship, you could also say, well, at the macro level, we might have to look at sort of the way these institutions are designed, because now, and also it's because of political pressures, and then it's sort of the, what the people want, right? They want to have people out of the welfare system, or, people should be fined if they don't get a job, or they with health benefits. So it's kind of this these kind of pressures that in the end seep into institutions. And I think, maybe in the Netherlands we see this kind of shift now because of this big scandal. So I'm just wondering maybe if we get a more trusting institution, which will maybe then seep into. So it might be the other way around also, like spillover from personal to institution, but also the other way around. That's just a thought I had. And the second is, I wondered, you started out with this clear distinction between trust and the distrust. In the end here, I wondered, like, did you really see that there were people that had sort of both, like, EnTrust and distrust at the same time? Because, yeah, I just wondered, because in the end, in the results, I didn't really see that. So I wondered if you really encountered such combination of trust and distrust.
Maybe Frederic has a follow-up.
Well, to link in with your first point, you say that sort of repair implementation deficiencies. It looks actually that the implementation needs to repair policy deficiencies.
Yes.
And the assumptions made about human beings that are now very much rational choice-based, so everyone goes for their own maximizing of gains, whereas that's not really necessarily true. So that links into how policies, it's austerity, it's administrative burdens, it's, people are not deserving. Those types of assumptions partially create this problem.
Yeah.
Can you say anything about that, or have you looked at the policies at all, or not?
We look at different work packages, as you all know. Now we divide work, but we have not triangulated so far this findings. Where we expected to find something, as you mentioned, is the Danish case, because the Danish case at least is less means testing, less intrusive, more social work oriented. That's what we were expecting, but the findings stayed still the same. So indeed, my first spontaneous reaction would be that basically institutional differences between countries, when you go down to the level of implementation, apparently seems to be marginal. But this is again a point we need to check whether there might be some elements. And your comment rather also says, what is being repaired? Is the inefficiency repaired? Because for some caseworkers, it's just a question, how can I solve the problem on the big pile of cases? I want to be as quick. I don't want to do a good job in terms of really helping. I'm being mean now. I simply want to empty my basket. This is repairing. The other thing is repairing is I really want to help the needy people, but I'm not allowed to. That's what you find out. So there is also a professional criticism of policies. And that's also why many of the frontline workers also seem kind of feel betrayed by politicians. That's what I said in the beginning. So there is an element of repairing. So that's why some cases were saying, I want to be nicer than the system. Let's put it this way. And then, so there is a second element of repairing. Yes.
Thank you.
And your second part.
Yes, it's about the coexistence of trust and distrust.
Yeah.
Well, there is, but indeed, then we would indeed need to go into the details of individual cases, because we do certainly have citizens who have some institutional trust, for instance, in law or in courts. So that they say, okay, my caseworker might be crap, and the welfare system is crap, but I know my rights. And I go to court, and I hope I will get help. So there is an element, if you like, the distrust in the welfare system is high, but there are some elements of trust in the constitutional level. Let's put it this way. So this is what I sense out of the material. And maybe there might be also elements where people trust specific parts of the procedure. But this is basically the secondary element. And as you see, I only looked at the dominant findings. That's why I'm also glad to take this with me and maybe to be more nuanced in regard to this dilemmatic element.
Yes, I see many people raising their hands. Let's start maybe with Tobias, who was waiting for long.
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting, and I think your findings speak to lots of the findings that we also see in the public administration literature on street-level bureaucrats. And I think in particular, so lots of the things you're mentioning kind of not super surprising in a sense to me from that perspective, but at the same time having this comparative perspective, I think that's something you don't see very often in this sort of research. And if you can kind of demonstrate that, okay, we basically see similar practices of bureaucrats and also of citizens, which are, I think, also less kind of researched in that literature. So that's really interesting. I have 3 concrete points. I'll try to make it quick. First one is more methodological. How would you get into contact with these vulnerable families? That's, I think, is really interesting. And the related point, my second point, is because you said in the beginning, you're understanding trust and distrust relationships as reciprocal relationships. So would you talk to both the kind of case officer and the family handled by that person so that you can kind of match them in a way? And the third point I have is this kind of finding that, well, there's generally a distrust in the institution. And I was wondering whether that may not also be even partially caused by street-level bureaucrats using sort of coping strategies, basically saying that, well, I want to help you, but it's like my boss, it's the system that doesn't allow me. So that will even, further strengthen distrust by clients into the system. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the last point I don't need to comment. Fully correct. The 2 other points basically is a trade-off.
Right.
The field access was complicated. I don't need to tell you, particularly in COVID times, because we also need official permissions, and public authorities are very suspicious to be spied by scientists, so it was complicated. It took a long time to convince public authorities to do their job. And recruiting vulnerable families was also complicated, but this was, at the end of the day, we did a lot of pragmatic things. We asked them, when we had the permission of the public authority and spoke with case officers, we asked them for families to contact. We went also through announcements in the offices. We provided incentives. Basic. We were allowed to pay, but we gave some kind of remuneration. It worked at the end. It worked. However, we were not able to observe encounters. This would have been the best option, and we were not able to match directly caseworkers what you were suggesting. This would be the optimum. We couldn't. So basically, we simply asked people. We analyzed reported encounters. That's a limit. Definitely.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the last round of questions because we are already beyond schedule. I think you want to ask something.
I want to come back to what Frederick and Stefan mentioned. Because I think on the slide that there is a rotation, yes, and that we are not allowed. So did the workers mention how they are prepared to work? How they are trained, and also in terms of this personal trust, that there is no need for personal close relationship between the worker. So this is and if you notice any difference between the workers that are very experienced or the fresh people in the job.
I would need to check whether there is a difference between the biographies. I could not answer this. As to the training, there is no really on-the-spot training. That's what we get in some countries. In Denmark and Germany, there is some. However, the problem is the high turnover among staff. So people are constantly replaced, and they come from other parts of the administration. So you see there. Basically, what it is on-the-job socialization. So they learn by doing, or they learn by superiors. So I would say there is a little systematic training within public authorities. Much of it is then relegated to the vocational training. So many of them are social workers. So I would say they are trained through their education. but they are little trained in their authorities. That's what seems to be the problem. And basically, not because of the high turnover, there is little chances of establishing this as a must.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So, thanks again for the presentation. So this probably comes from me being Italian, and we always complain about everything. So, but jokes apart, I was thinking about this distinction between trust and distrust, and the fact that, and this also what I feel here is the fact that it seems like if I'm wondering if you make so the example is these people keep going to these services, right? So I'm not so convinced that there is no trust at all, but I find it very convincing that there might be some distrust and some trust. But at the end of the day, if there's no trust at all, I don't vote, right? So I'm wondering whether you could use measures like better measures to get this trust that might be there. But maybe reflects on more like the behavioral side of this individual. Let's call it behavioral trust, or I don't know how to call it. Maybe more in this trust than when they are actually expressing their work.
Well, this would require to look more deeply into the chronicle of encounters, so in the behavior of citizens. How often do they go, and why do they go? And that's a challenge. What I can answer is that basically there are two motives for people to go there. They want to have something, and they go there. That's pure instrumental. And secondly is they try to prevent meetings as much as they can if the meetings are not helpful. If the meetings are helpful, they try to go as often as they can. But then we are back with the element of the personal relation to the caseworker. So I would say that the official meetings are a threat to many of the vulnerable people. First, because they might get a no for their application, or because they might be threatened. You don't look for your children, whatever. So there is always a fear that these official meetings might go bad. But when they go regularly, there is indeed, as you say, there is some trust. But the argument is that the reason why people like to go back is the personal trust they have to their casework. But I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but that's at least what the data seems to convey.
But of course, you didn't capture those who don't go, even though they can be eligible for benefits.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, maybe the very last comments. I think you.
I guess
I cannot get in the break. That's fine.
Great. Thanks very much for your flexibility. Okay, thank you very much. It's 1:15. We are 15 minutes late, but I think we've had a great talk and a great discussion. Thank you very much again. I suggest that we make the break shorter, 15 minutes, just to have a cup of coffee, and we resume then. Thanks very much.